Shalom, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of the course that we've been doing within our synagogue at Simcha Israel on Introduction to Messianic Judaism. Due to a technical glitch, which is really I forgot to hit record, the session that we did this last week for week 2 of the series was not recorded. So I'm going to do just a quick highlight here for those of you who have been participating virtually. And for those of you who have found your way maybe to these videos, if you want the outlines, every week there is an outline. You can either just contact me directly, just rabbi@simchaisrael.org, or our office at simchaisrael.org. And we'd be more than happy to get you set up to receive the outlines. So I'm going to be mostly working from that outline. So this week we're focusing primarily on this question of halachah and Judaism as faith in action. And I begin with a couple of quotes here. One is what I call the James principle from the letter of James, which I'm actually preaching through right now within our synagogue. So if you're interested in that series, because it really dovetails really nicely with what I'm talking about here, you can find that on our Simcha Israel YouTube channel as well. But in James 1:22 and then in 2:18, James writes, "Don't deceive yourselves by only hearing what the word says, but do it. But someone will say that you have faith and I have actions. Show me this faith of yours without actions, and I will show you my faith by my actions." Right? What I call the James principle, which is really a continuation of again, what I call the fig tree principle, is Yeshua's words that you know a tree by the fruit that it produces. The reason why Yeshua curses the fig tree is because the fig tree claims to produce figs, but doesn't actually produce figs. So Yeshua curses the fig tree because a tree that doesn't produce fruit is not what it claims to be, right? And this is that fig tree principle that James is just kind of wording differently. That you ask me about my faith, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. And then here's a quote by one of my favorite Jewish thinkers, Abraham Joshua Heschel. "A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought. In carrying out the word of the Torah, he is ushered into the presence of a spiritual meaning. Through the ecstasy of deeds, he learns to be certain of the nearness of God. Right living is a way to right thinking." Again, this idea that faith and action are not meant to be diametrically opposed, but are actually meant to complement one another. Now, can you get things out of balance? Of course, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a healthy balance between faith and action, which is not only biblical, but this is the Jewish, the traditional Jewish approach, that faith and action go hand in hand. So when we're talking about faith in action, it's helpful to think about the rhythms of Jewish life, right? And then I'm going to unpack this a little more. But the rhythms of Jewish life have to do not just with the holiday cycle, and I include I'm not going to go through it in detail, but a brief outline, just a couple of sentences on what each of the major Jewish holidays are. So that's in the outline. But as we go throughout the course of the year, you can feel these rhythms as you progress, right? And in the same way within our secular world or the seasonal calendar, you feel the changes with, for example, the seasons. It's when it's getting cooler and the leaves change and there's Christmas and a crispness in the air. You feel that it's fall, right? When it gets even colder and then snow begins to fall, it's winter, right? You feel these rhythms. And in the same way within our calendars, right? And within the Jewish calendars especially, there's these rhythms and in the same way, on a daily basis, there are these rhythms as we go through the rituals of daily life with when we wake up, the prayers that we recite, right, as we go throughout our day and the rhythms of Jewish practice, as well as the life cycles throughout our lives. Throughout our lives, there are these rhythms that we that we go through, that you experience. And so all of this kind of forms this kind of like beating sort of heart that you will, if you will, as we progress through these various cycles. I'm going to be reading a little bit from the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council's Standards of Observance, which you can find on their website. And again, you can find the citation within the outline if you want it, but it's just www.ourrabbis.org. Okay, you can go to the drop-down menu for the Standards of Observance, and I always tell people that everybody wants to jump to what we say about Shabbat or whatever, but really the introduction is the most important part of the whole thing, because it really gives you an approach to the way that we think about Halachah, the way that we think about our role within the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, and so on. So anyway, let me read from you just a little bit from the holidays section, because I think it helps set up this helps set up what we're talking about. And in the class, I would have had other people read this, so you don't have to listen to me drone on and on. But if you are watching this video, you're stuck with me. So it says, just about everyone has a calendar in their kitchen, and there is probably not a kitchen calendar anywhere without hand-drawn circles and scribbled notes. What are these notes and circles? They are the appointments and commitments that make each family unique. What is true for every family in America is true as well for the family of Israel, scattered around the globe and sown across time and eternity. The holidays of Israel are our unique calendar, circled and scribbled, stained with cholent, wine, charoset, birthday cake, and sometimes even blood. But this calendar is what stitches us together as a family, enabling the scattered and transgenerational family to rejoice together, to weep together, and to steep in fragrant memory. And just as it is erosive to family ties to forget birthdays and anniversaries, so Jewish identity erodes and our ties with each other unravel when we fail to honor our common calendar. While neglecting these holy days, both the happy ones and the sad, will not annul our family status, can there be any doubt that such neglect weakens family ties? Because it is important for us to be familiar with each other, all the holidays are important, the big ones and the little ones. They are no burden. They are the stitching that binds us to each other, and by which we honor the one who is the Father of us all. So that kind of gives you just a sense of why these rhythms are so important, in particular when we're talking about the Chagim, the holidays. Again, I don't have time to unpack a lot of this in incredible detail, so I'm just kind of giving you snippets of ideas and things to then continue to process. So it's just kind of the nature of an introductory class, right, is that you can only just touch on various topics. So in addition, when we talk about the rhythms of Jewish life, that obviously all of this is rooted in the Torah itself. And the word Torah, although it's often translated in Christian Bibles as law, really the word Torah means instruction or teaching. It's from the root yara. And there's in kind of like a word picture idea that when you think about an arrow that you shoot from a bow, that hits a target, the Torah is like that arrow that hits the target of humanity's needs. Like it serves a purpose. It is the teaching or instruction for what it means to live in a way that God would expect us to live. Now, let me just go by what's in the notes here. The Torah and the Jewish people are interwoven together and cannot be separated. The Torah and the way it has been uniquely interpreted and applied over time defines us as a people. In a play on a famous quote from Echad Ha'am, one could even say, more than the Jews have kept Torah, Torah has kept the Jews. Now that's a play on Echad Ha'am. Echad Ha'am says, more than Shabbat has kept the Jews have kept Shabbat. More than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. And I just kind of tweaked this in an article that I wrote. By the way, a lot of this is from an article you can find on my academia page. And it's also was published in a collection of papers on the Brumbach Symposium, but it's called The Role of Torah in Jewish Tradition in the Messianic Jewish Community. It was paper presented at the Brumbach Symposium, a gathering of leaders that discuss various issues and ideas within the Messianic Jewish community. And so it's also available on the Brumbach Symposium website. Anyway, so what I'm going to go through is I'll draw on a lot from that particular paper. According to Heschel, who I quoted just a moment ago, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Bible is an answer to the supreme question, what does God demand of us? Right? The Hebrew Bible doesn't begin, unlike other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, with trying to explain the origins of God or give an apologetic for the existence of God. The existence of God is just assumed, right? So therefore the question is, what next, right? What then does God expect of us? If we are God's followers, then what does God expect of us? And that's where, the primary focus of Judaism asks that question and then tries over the last 3,300 years to then answer that question. From the Jewish perspective, for us as Jews, the Torah is more than the stipulations of the covenant between ourselves and God. It is more than just 613 different ways to connect with our Creator. The Torah speaks into the deepest places of our souls and tells us where we came from, who we truly are, and where we are going. It defines our behavior and shapes our interaction with the world around us. Without the Torah, we cannot know what it means to be holy and what God expects of us. Furthermore, without the Torah, there would be no prophet greater than Moses, or the renewal and greater realization and internalization of the covenant in and through Messiah Yeshua. In fact, if we are to take the Gospel of John seriously, then for us as Messianic Jews, the Torah is our ultimate symbol of faith. Because if Yeshua is the living Torah, meaning the Word made flesh, which dwells among us, according to John 1, then the Torah service is not only a sacred reenactment of the events of Sinai, but also a dramatic reenactment of the gospel message itself. One of the key principles of Judaism is this idea of sacred drama, that we don't just do something because it's a tradition and we just, it's one of the things we just do, but rather this concept of sacred drama is this idea that we don't just do it, we re-experience it, we reenact it whenever we do it. And the Torah service is an example of this. Whenever the Torah is removed from the ark, it becomes a sacred drama. We are again standing at Mount Sinai, and we once again have the opportunity to say, Na'aseh v'nishma. God, everything that you have said we will do and we will hear, meaning we will obey it. And everything is like this. And by the way, this concept comes from the Torah itself. So the Torah tells us in Exodus 20, right after the giving of the 10 utterances, or otherwise known as the 10 commandments, there's this idea that, and later it's repeated in Deuteronomy, this idea that all of Israel stood at Mount Sinai, when it says that I make this covenant not only with you who are here now, but with those of you who are not yet here, right? That this idea that this covenant is being made, and all Jews stood at Mount Sinai when this covenant was made, those who are here now and those who are not yet here. So there's this sacred reenactment in the sense of a sacred drama. Whenever we do this, we are reliving that experience, and we once again have the opportunity to say, Na'aseh v'nishma, right? Also, for example, in Passover, Deuteronomy, which is not the generation that experienced these events, it's their children and grandchildren, Moses says, when you do these things, you are supposed to say, actually, this is in one of the places where, if you're familiar with the Passover Haggadah, not the four questions, but there's the child, when you're the four children, right? And this comes actually from four different places in the Torah when it says, when your child asks you, what is the reason why we do these things? It says you're supposed to tell them, and this is one of the Deuteronomy passages, that when God delivered me from Egypt, What do you mean God delivered you? This is, again, the generation of Deuteronomy. This is the children, grandchildren. But it's implying that I was there. When God delivered me from Egypt, and we're told in Exodus that perpetually, that whenever you celebrate the Passover, you're supposed to do it with your staff in hand, with your coat on, right? You are re-experiencing the Exodus every time you do the Passover Seder, right? Again, it's not just a tradition. It's a re-experience of the events as they were and as they are now. In every generation, we're delivered from Egypt, and Egypt might not be a physical place on a map for you. Egypt might be the struggles and the pain that you are currently going through. Whatever the situation is that you need to be delivered from this year, may that actually happen for you. So in the same way, this idea of sacred drama, that for us as Messianic Jews, if we take this idea seriously, right? Even the promise of this renewal of the covenant goes back to Jeremiah 31. And the fulfillment of that is in John 1. The Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, right? That Yeshua is the living Torah in our midst. So therefore, when we remove the Torah from the ark each week, it is also a sacred drama of the gospel message, the incarnation of the living Torah, right? And when we carry it through the community and the processional, it's this, the spreading of the message. And just as it's brought up and read from, right, this is the proclamation of the message. And when we lift up the Torah, just as Yeshua says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all people unto myself. And so there's this idea of, we exalt the Torah, and when we put it, in the ark, it's a picture of the ascension and the excitement that we have, knowing that this isn't the very last time we're ever going to put this Torah in the ark. This next, actually on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we also read from the Torah, but, many people are familiar, especially with Shabbat and holidays. Anyway, every time the Torah is taken out, it's again this revelation. So to continue, and by the way, I know this is a lot. I don't have the time to actually unpack every single one of these things, but I'm more than happy if you have questions or whatever, please email me. And also we'll unpack a lot of these things as we progress through this 8-week class. So this is week 2. We still have, some weeks ahead. As I sort of mentioned, this idea of this renewal of the covenant, what most people call new covenant, in Jeremiah 31, God says, I will renew the covenant that I made with the house of Israel and Judah, and it will not be like the one that I made with their ancestors. Instead, I will place it within you, right? There's a certain internalization that it will be. And this idea of new that's used in Jeremiah, and by the way, even the Greek uses the same concept, but the word chadash in Hebrew doesn't mean brand new, like out of nowhere. It has to do with this cycle. For example, this cycle of the moon, whenever we get to a new Jewish month, it's called Rosh Chodesh, right? But when it's a new moon, it's not like there's a brand new moon. No, it's this cycle. It's a renewal of the cycle of the moon that happens every month, right? And there are other instances that support this idea, but it's a renewal. It's not a brand new covenant that God's going to do away with the covenant of Israel and give a new one. It's this renewal of the covenant, and we see that fulfilled in John 1. And part of this internalization is then a fulfillment that was prophesied even by the prophets, that this message would be taken not just to Israel but then to the nations, right? And again, this was always expected. Israel was expected even in the Torah to be or legoyim, a light to the nations. Now, that doesn't mean the nations become Israel or become Jews, but they do participate in this commonwealth of Israel. They receive blessings from Israel. So back to my outline here. This new covenant or renewal of the covenant is not the replacement of, but rather the renewal of, and a greater intensification and internalization of the Torah through the living Torah, Yeshua the Messiah. Again, Jeremiah 31, John 1, etc. Additionally, the outpouring of the Spirit is not only to spiritually empower and comfort us, but according to Ezekiel 36 and 37, enables us to observe the mitzvot. Part of the reason God promises is to give us the Holy Spirit is so that we can observe the mitzvot. Again, according to Heschel, the Bible is the history of God in search of man. More than we think we're the ones pursuing God, God is actually the one who is in pursuit of us. So how does our relationship with Yeshua affect our understanding of Torah? If he is the living Torah, how does that shape who we are? Well, we'll talk more about this here, but also in future weeks. But one is when we talk about the mitzvot, when we talk about the commandments of the Torah, that again, I want to emphasize that this false dichotomy of law versus grace, right? Instead, it's meant to be this integration of the two, that you ask me about my faith and I'll show you my faith by what I do. Or the fig tree principle, that you know a tree by the fruit that it produces. It doesn't matter what it claims to be. If it has no fruit to support that idea, then that's not what it is, right? Rather, the 613 mitzvot, the 613 commandments is the way that it's traditionally broken down in Jewish tradition. All the commandments of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is rather we can think of these 613 commandments as 613 different ways to connect to Hashem, to connect to our Creator. Now, obviously, the commandments, and I don't have time to go into this, relate to different people differently, to Jews, differently from Gentiles, from men, from women. If you are descended from Aaron, if you're a Cohen or if you're a Levite, whatever, the Torah applies differently to people covenantally and stuff, but we don't have time to go into that. Let's just talk about, just sort of the broad application of Torah. Yeshua mentions, and I'm going to unpack this a little more in a moment, but this idea of weightier matters. And you can see this especially in Matthew 23:23, and understanding a balance, that when it comes to conflicting mitzvot, how do you know which one is a weightier matter? So Yeshua tends to prioritize those mitzvot which have to do relationally, that affect our relationship with one another, take priority against the ones that you do by yourself, that only affect you. Right? Everything is between you and God, but if there is something that affects you, that directly affects you and doesn't influence anybody else, that isn't as high of a priority as those which affect one another, right? So those relational aspects. And again, we'll talk more about this. I want to again emphasize the value of tradition. Judaism is not sola scriptura. And if you know what that means, if you don't, that's okay. But for those of you who are familiar with this idea of we only, it's only a rigid understanding of the Bible itself. If it says it in the Bible, or if it doesn't say it, we only go by with what the Bible says. The problem with this is that even the concept of sola scriptura is tradition. The canon, everything that we think about is interpreted through the lens of tradition. The challenge of the Bible is it must be interpreted, both because it's a collection of books. It's not a single book. It's a collection of books written over an expanse of time. And with different genres of literature, you have poetry, you have law, you have narrative, you have lament, right? These different styles of writing. All of this needs to be filtered, and we live in a different context than what's going on. And and also whenever the Bible even instructs us in something, often when we're just reading through it, it seems like, gosh, it's so detailed, it doesn't leave anything out, until you actually go to do it. And then you realize it's not as detailed as I thought it was. There's this really great book. I was looking on my shelves around me. My whole office is bookshelves. I believe it's called The Year of Living Biblically by A.J. Jacobs, who's a Jewish guy who's not necessarily religious or anything, but he has done a couple things where he, does something for a year and then writes a book on it. And he decided to, The Year of Living Biblically is his journey from deciding I'm going to be just literally follow the Bible. I'm going to live biblically for a year. And he tried to be as literal as possible. If the Bible says do it, he was going to do it. If it says don't do it, he wasn't going to do it. And part of the wonderful journey, and it's a fun read. You might not agree with, everything in it, that's fine, but it emphasizes this idea that as detailed as you think the Bible is, when you actually go to do it, you realize it doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do in the detail that you need often to actually observe it. And so you see where he runs into these challenges where he goes to do something, but he has to at times consult tradition. And so when he has to consult tradition, he tries to do it at least in the most literal way possible. But anyway, it's a really great support for this idea of the need for tradition, that unless a tradition directly contradicts Scripture, tradition is just tradition, right? It's neither good nor bad. It's what you put into it and how you live it out. But you have to have tradition. And everything we do, there's a lot of people in the fringe Messianic movement, fringe parts of the Messianic movement who are like, well, I only do the biblical stuff. Really? Like what? Oh, well, I'll wear a talit because that's biblical. Really? Last time I checked, Numbers 15 only says you're supposed to put tzitzit on the corners of your garment so that you will look upon them and remember all the commandments of your Lord. Do them. But it doesn't ever once explain what tzitzit are, how they're supposed to be tied. They're supposed to be put on a garment. Is that a special garment? Is it your jeans? Is it, what garment requires this? On the corner of your garment? Okay, does that mean it has to be 4 corners, 6 corners, 2 corners? What constitutes a garment that requires whatever tzitzit are, right? The Bible doesn't tell us, okay? It doesn't tell us to make a prayer shawl with 4 corners, white with black stripes or blue stripes or whatever stripes, right? And to, be 4 threads that are, tied together, 8 strands, then you know what I mean? All this is tradition. Or the people who are like, oh, well, I'll blow a shofar because that's biblical. Really? What sounds are you going to blow on your shofar? Because the whole tekiah, shevarim, truah, most of that is all tradition, right? So everything we do is filtered through the lens of tradition. It's just, that's reality, right? Now, again, you might not agree with every tradition. That's fine. This is not that class where I'm trying to convince you of different things. We're just talking in general. But what I want you to see is that tradition is tradition. It's both valuable and everybody does it. And we do it not just religiously, but culturally. So, for example, I love to give this example, especially in a mixed group, where they're like Jews and Christians. But if I go into a synagogue and say, let's pray, everybody stands up and opens a book. And if I go into a church and say, let's pray, everybody tends to bow their head and close their eyes. Now, which one is more correct? Technically, neither of them are, right? It has to do with the condition of your heart. If what you're praying by standing up and opening a siddur, a prayer book, it's with the right intention and kavanah, then that is true, authentic prayer. If your prayer is more spontaneous and just you bow your head, you close your eyes, and what you say is coming out to the depths of your neshama, and you say it with real intention, what we call kavanah, then that is authentic prayer, right? So whether you stand up, whether you sit down and bow your head and close your eyes, these are cultural experiences of prayer, right? They're cultural. Depending on where, and where you live in the world will affect what your prayer looks like, because culturally it will look different. Now, I'm going on a lot of rabbit trails, but let's try to come back here. So the value of tradition, again, this is from that article of mine. The role of Torah in Jewish tradition and the Messianic Jewish community. We need to think about tradition as rather a vehicle for identifiable Jewish living. According to Dr. David Stern, Alav Shalom, may he rest in peace, if we call ourselves Messianic Jews, We must intend to back up our words with actions demonstrating that our Jewishness has substance. So that's why we need to study Jewish texts. If we're going to talk about if we're going to use the title Judaism or Jewish, then it needs to look Jewish and it needs to look like a form of Judaism. Often, what is practiced in Messianic synagogues is not that, right? It is neither Jewish nor Christian, and this is where, there needs to be a healthy approach and a balanced, mature approach to understanding Messianic Judaism, the foundations of what it is to be a Messianic Jew or part of a Messianic Jewish congregation. And this is unpacking more from that paper. And you can tell in this particular section, my wife, who is a lawyer, had a little influence on this. So it may be helpful to think of the Torah as a set of statutes needing regulatory interpretation. Statutes lay out broad brush policies and establish legal norms, but they still need to be interpreted and applied to a variety of contexts. Hence the body of case law, where legal authorities consult not only the original set of statutes, but all their interpretations and applications as well. If we think of the Torah as, for example, the Constitution of the United States, so as the Constitution, then the body of interpretive case law would be the halachic codes and responsa. Just as a body of courts were established to interpret and apply the Constitution, so too Jewish courts and halachic authorities were established to interpret and apply the Torah. As such, just as the United States cannot operate in accordance with the Constitution without the interpretive guidance of the judiciary, so too we as a movement cannot operate in accordance with the Torah without the interpretive guidance of our tradition, right? This is far more important than most people realize. Now, I already mentioned that when we talk about observance, we need to have a balance between, yes, this is the way that it should be done properly, but this is also the intention, right, that we put behind it, that we don't just do it by rote, that we have a level of intentionality. And what the rabbis call these two different things is, one is keva. Keva means, structure. It's the form, the set practice. Keva is the way that you're supposed to do it, if you will. And kavanah is the intention, right? It's our heart that we put into it, if you will. For example, according to Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, this is in reference to prayer. He uses in this quote the Hebrew word it's not Hebrew, it's a Yiddish word to daven, which just means prayer. But in the Jewish sense, it means liturgical prayer, right? Like a more formalized prayer, but it's still supposed to be done with, that it comes out of you, right? According to Reb Zalman, to daven with kavanah means to pray with focus, intention, meaning. It means praying from the heart rather than praying centered solely in the mind, right? That we're supposed to put all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind into it. Our challenge is to live out meaningful traditional practices and experiences that are not just true to keva, right? The proper and right way to do things, but also to provide opportunities to encounter the divine, which we do through kavanah, right? So this balance of the way that you're supposed to do it with, the proper intention behind it. We also need to talk about the centrality of Yeshua. That when I think of a mature Messianic Judaism, it's not just Judaism plus Yeshua as a tack on or as an afterthought, but rather Yeshua and the teachings of our Messiah permeate our understanding of Judaism. This is why the earliest followers of Yeshua, the Jewish followers of Yeshua, called themselves Haderech, right? The way. Because this, from their perspective, this was the way to practice Judaism. By the way, they weren't the only ones to call themselves the way. Prior to the followers of Yeshua was the Qumran community, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't have time to unpack that, but if you're familiar with them, they called themselves the way also. Because again, they perceived of themselves as the right way to practice Judaism. In the same way that the followers of Yeshua saw themselves as Haderech. This is the way. This is the way. If you know what I'm talking about, this is the way to practice Judaism. So we need to talk about the centrality of Yeshua. And I want to just, again, I wish I had time to really unpack these, but I want to give you a couple quotes from my friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer. Rav Kinzer says, "Ours is a Judaism that believes that the Messiah has come and that his name is Yeshua of Nazareth." According to Kinzer, as Messianic Jews, we affirm two truths as central to our faith and identity. One is God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people, embodied and guarded by the Torah. And two, God's reconciling and revealing work for Israel and the nations in Messiah Yeshua. This is powerful. And these are the two truths that that Messianic Judaism is, often the larger Jewish community or the wider, those within the Gentile Christian church want you to choose one or the other. You're either a follower of Yeshua or you are a faithful Jew who is, faithful to the covenantal responsibilities of Jewish life. Now, our argument, and this is why we get such pushback, is we believe that these are equal obligations and that they are one and the same. Right? If Yeshua is the living Torah, then we're supposed to follow the Torah, right? As understood through the living Torah, Yeshua the Messiah, right? Like we are both faithful Jews and faithful to Messiah Yeshua. I don't know if I have this quote in here, but Dr. David Stern writes that as Messianic Jews, we are both 100% Messianic and 100% Jewish, no matter who accepts it or denies it, right? Outside, but this is who we are. We have these responsibilities to the covenant we have as Jews to Yeshua. To God and through the Torah, and to Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, right? And those of you who are Messianic Gentiles or intermarried to Jewish people, you have a connection to the Torah that might be a little bit different, but there's still this sort of as understood through the Messiah. Again, to quote Heschel, who is not a Messianic Jew, obviously, but really kind of gets this idea. The question of religion is what we do with the presence of God. How to think, how to feel, how to act, how to live in a way compatible with our being created in the image of God. This is what this is faith in action. This is a quote from one of my heroes. Actually, you can see a picture of him. He's the middle guy up here, Paul Philip Levertov, one of the great early Jewish believers, graduate of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and then went on to be a scholar. And then, anyway, he became a Jewish follower of Yeshua. He writes, "The deepest longing, therefore, of the genuine chassid is to become a living Torah. The keeping of the law is to him only a means to an end, union with God. And for this reason, he tries to keep the law scrupulously, for God's thoughts are embodied in it." Now, he uses the old English for Torah, law, but what he means is the Torah, right? Like the reason why we do these things is not to just go through the motions. We do it to connect with God. It's all about relationship, right? Union with God is what Levertov says. So for this reason, we try to keep it scrupulously, for God's thoughts are embodied in it, right? That we are supposed to emulate our Messiah. And so in many ways, we're supposed to become like embodiments, like not that we become Messiah, but like little Messiahs, if you will. In the same way, we're supposed to become living Torahs, right? Not that we are the Torah, or that we replace the Torah, whatever, but that the Torah becomes ingrained in us and that we become a living Torah, that he says. So the only way to live out tradition and these things is in the sense, at least from a Jewish perspective, and that's the approach that I know, and that this is what we do, is from this sense of halachah. Now, often the Hebrew term halachah is usually translated as Jewish law, but that's not really what we're talking about here, and I don't think it's the most helpful. The word halachah comes from the Hebrew word holech, which means to walk. If I just say, like, I'm going to walk to the grocery store, I'm going to walk to the park, like I use the Hebrew word holech. Ani holech le supermarket, or ani holech le gan, like, going to walk to the park or the garden or whatever. So the word halachah just really means the way of living Jewishly, or the way that I'm supposed to walk in relationship to God. It's the way to live Jewishly. And it's more than a random list of do's and don'ts, right? According to I already mentioned earlier, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council Standards of Observance, our congregation, Simcha Israel, happens to be a member congregation of something called the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, as well as affiliated with the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. I currently serve as the president, actually, of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. So in quoting from our Standards of Observance, this is again in the introduction to that document, it says, which is, by the way, the standards themselves are evolving as we continue to work out, questions and stuff. So, but this is from our Standards of Observance. It says, and I quote, Halachah refers to the authoritative application of the rules of the Torah in the form of concrete decisions in response to the circumstances of daily life, all in the context of the covenantal life of the people of Israel. Because every age, location, culture, and socio-political circumstance is unique, new questions inevitably arise which lead to fresh developments in halachah. Thus, while rooted in a stable ground of well-defined and universally recognized laws, halachah remains dynamic, a living and growing organism rather than a static and flexible legal code. Halachic authority consists in the communally acknowledged competence to interpret, develop, and apply the rules of the Torah for a particular situation and social group. And I again encourage you that if you're interested in knowing more about this and unpacking this more, to read that introduction to the MJRC Standards of Observance, which again you can find online at ourrabbis.org. So one word, ourrabbis.org. Again, pulling from that article I wrote, if Messianic Judaism claims to be a Judaism, then it behooves us to consider the place of halachah in our midst. Jewish law was never meant to be static, but rather to be interpreted in every generation. Rabbi Wayne Dosick describes halachah as ever developing and ever evolving, right? That as new situations arise, as the MJRC standards mention, we have to be able to apply new circumstances, but not just make up our own new rules. What we do is all of halachah is based on the site. And by the way, this is where common law also comes from. Like our legal system is this idea of precedence, right? You make decisions based off of similar situations and decisions of the past. And so when you then approach a new situation, you try to find principles of precedent that then apply to a different situation. And this happens all the time and in everything that comes up. When computers were introduced, that created new questions, new halachic questions. When automobiles were introduced, that raised new halachic questions. Can you ride in these? Can you drive in these? Can you do it on Shabbat? Can you not do it on Shabbat? All these questions every time, and circumstances, right? What happens when I was driving down the road and I bumped into someone and they were not, or I bumped into their car, but nobody was in the car and there was no damage. What are my responsibilities, right? Should I just drive away? Should I leave a note? These are halachic and ethical questions and things that arise and have to be addressed. Halachah is derived, as I just mentioned, from evolving case law, which is based upon prior precedent, much like our own American legal system. As such, it is developed by wrestling with texts, the practices of daily life, and the teachings of previous generations in order to decide halachic matters. It is a process that is not set in stone and not without inerrancy, but it's a process, right? So a Messianic Jewish approach to halachah would be not only kind of wrestling with these things, and by the way, all forms of Judaism wrestle with the halachah, and they do it differently, but they have to do it, right? And we have a responsibility to do so as well. At the same time, we need to consider that, the New Testament is not a halachic code. It gives us some halachic guidance, maybe not as much as we would find helpful, but there are some things that can guide guide us. And one of these things is the weightier matters, right? That there are things that we're supposed to do without neglecting the weightier matters. And in this case, those which are relational, right? Everything boils down to our love God, love one another. I don't have time to unpack that now. But this is what it boils down to. And we have a responsibility, yes, to serve God, but also in loving one another. What does that look like? And that needs to take a priority over, for example, I can't claim to love God and then treat people like garbage, right? Or anyway, so we need to have a relational approach in the way that we interpret and apply halakha. So this is, and in the packets I have, again, is when we're talking about rhythms of time and the calendar and Jewish holidays, that you can find an abbreviation of those things within the notes for this week. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. And I'm sure it raises far more questions than you received answers, but welcome to Jewish life, right? That's the way that it goes. For everything, there is new situations arise and require far more questions, right? For everything, there's just should raise more questions. But anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. If you would like a copy of the notes and you're not on a regular study group, you can reach out to me at rabbi@simchatyisrael.org. Okay? Shavua Tov, everyone.